And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. Chapters is the television program that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. And I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. Our guest today is former professor and author Philip St. Clair. And Philip St. Clair is the author of 4 books of poetry, including Acid Creek, Little Dog of Iron, All the Tent of Heaven, and In the 39 Steps. His 2 chapbooks are Divided House and number 176 in Pudding Press's Greatest Hits series from 2003. He's received grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kentucky Arts Council, and he was awarded the Bullis Prize from Poetry Northwest in 1986. His poems have been published in over 200 journals and magazines, including Beloit Poetry Journal, Black Warrior Review, Gettysburg Review, Harper's, Journal of Kentucky Studies, Main Street Rag, Oyez Review, Paper Street, Prairie Schooner, Plowshares, Poetry Review, Shenandoah, and Southern Poetry Review. His work has appeared in anthologies from the University of Akron Press, Southern Illinois University Press, and the University Press of Kentucky. Philip St. Clair was born in Warren, Ohio in 1944, and after graduating from high school in 1961, he enlisted in the United States Air Force and was assigned to the Military Air Transport Service. After his honorable discharge in 1965, he attended Kent State University from 1966 to 1974, receiving a BA, MA, and MLS degrees, and in 1985, he earned an MFA from Bowling Green State University. He's worked as a librarian, a bartender, and a writer, indexer, and editor, both in-house and freelance. His teaching experience includes adjunct faculty appointments at Kent State University, a 1-year instructorship at Bowling Green State University, and a 5-year lectureship at Southern Illinois University. In 1991, he came to Ashland Community College, now Ashland Community and Technical College, and he retired from there in 2010, and he lives right now currently with his wife, Christina, in Ashland, Kentucky. And we are so pleased to have a distinguished writer with us today, Philip St. Clair. Philip, thank you so much for being on Chapters. It's great to have you.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about how you got started in writing and how you found yourself creating and creating different kinds of works as a writer.
Well, I got started in writing poetry because of the poems I was reading in high school, in my literature courses in high school. That was part of it. And what really got me started was reading the beatniks, Ginsberg and Corso and Ferlinghetti and all of those people, and especially Howell. Ginsberg's poem Howell was and still is to me quite a revelation. It appealed to the disaffected young fellow that I was when I was in high school, and of course it was also the era of Holden Caulfield, and there were a great deal of Holden Caulfield, I think, in me at the time. And it was the standard pattern. See the book, see the poem, see the short story, and say, gee, I really like this. And then your next thought is, well, I can do that. So that's the way it started, and I'm certainly not alone in the way that writers get started, or artists, or musicians. They appreciate something, and then they immediately say, well, that I can do. So that's how it went.
Oh, excellent.
That's how it went.
Excellent. You mentioned Holden Caulfield and Ginsberg and some of those writers and poets. Were those the poets that influenced you even today when you write, or are there other maybe more contemporary writers that have influenced your work?
Yeah, there are. I think more of the more contemporary writers, the people that I appreciate are Sharon Olds is one contemporary writer, and William Matthews, Stephen Dobbins, people like that.
When you look at poetry and you look at the genre of poetry, and we've had some other poets on our program, it is very much sort of a polarizing genre, in that people either, as readers, really like it or they're intimidated by it. And I think that is true of writers, too. People tend to follow that genre as a writer and something that they're comfortable with, and sometimes writers will stay away from that. What do you think, as a writer of poetry and as a writer of different literary works, what would you say are some of the hardest parts about poetry as a writer, and what are some of the parts that for you are easiest when it comes to writing poetry?
Well, I think the hardest part of me for writing is to go through that first draft, go from point A to point B. That's what takes the energies, and that's what's difficult. Revising, of course, poets are notorious for revising over and over and over again. That's a different process, and as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't seem to be as bothersome as getting that first draft, even though that first draft is so rough and so imperfect and so flawed. But it's the drafting it's the revising rather that doesn't seem to be as onerous.
And it seems like even though poems aren't quite as long as novels or short stories in terms of word count, that the amount of revision, as you're talking about, is still the same, and you still have to approach it with that same meticulous.
Most poets, I can't speak for everybody. Allen Ginsberg claimed never to do much revising. His motto was first thought, best thought. Right? I'm afraid I could never get the hang of that first thought being the best thought. I had to beat that first thought over the head and shoulders and to refine it and mess with it and tinker with it.
Where do you get a lot of inspiration for your poetry? Does it come from your life experience? Does it come from people you know? Where do you draw a lot of inspiration?
All of that. Life experience, people I know, family stories that have been passed down, embarrassing moments and that sort of thing. And something that happened 50 years ago when one aunt got angry at another uncle, and it's a story that every family has them, and they get carried down throughout the generations, and that's a source, has been a source.
Let me ask you a little bit about the grant that you received from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kentucky Arts Council.
Mm-hmm.
I know West Virginia and people from West Virginia and writers in West Virginia are fortunate to have a humanities council where you can apply for endowments and fellowships and grants. How did you seek out the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kentucky Arts Council? Was this a project you were working on that you wanted to get some funding for? Was it for research? Or how did you apply for that, and how did you get interested in applying for those grants?
Well, I think everyone who takes writing seriously, and it's especially poets, because there's absolutely no money in writing poetry unless you can wangle a job at a high school or at a college. But the poetry itself is not going to put the beans on the table. The standard way announcements are made, when to apply. These days you can apply online to get your NEA grants and your local arts council, state arts council grants. And they will ask you if you're working on a kind of a project, and you can say, yes, I'm working on a project of such and so. You can couch the terms in broad enough manner that. But it's these days it's all pretty pro forma stuff. It's about getting the forms. What has changed in the past is that the grants councils are usually restricting the amounts of grants that you can get in the course of your lifetime. I think the NEA used to be 3. You can only get 3 grants during your lifetime, but I think they've cut that back. And certainly the Kentucky Arts Council is beginning to restrict, and I suppose it's okay to give other people a chance to get the money and to get the prestige, especially the validation. I think the money's nice, but it's the validation that someone else has looked at your work and said, "Gee, this is good stuff." So we'll give him or her the money. And my suggestion to all those people who may be looking is to apply for grants. It's I don't know how many years I applied for grants before I finally got one, but it was a long time.
So if someone out there is interested in doing that, have the perseverance to keep going and keep trying.
Perseverance is all when applying for grants, and everything must be perfect, and presentation is all. And I think they look at the work more than anything else. I mean, it's nice to say, well, I'm going to, write a series of epic poems about Granny Jones, who lived in lived back in the frontier days. That's all well and good, but they will be looking at the writing first and foremost. That's my experience.
Okay. How did that help you? You mentioned it was great to get that validation and that recognition for your work, but after you achieved or was awarded those grants, How did that help you down the road? Did it make it easier for you to get some of your work published?
I think it did. I think it did. If you pick up the better magazines, better journals, they have artist profiles and writers profiles in the back of the magazines, little blurbs, and most of them say, well, such and so, Joe Blow got a grant from the NEA or from the Arkansas Arts Council, and it's something that editors look at.
Very good.
They really do. They really do.
Excellent. Very good. Tell us a little bit about this Bullis Prize from Poetry Northwest in 1986. How did that come about? How did you win that? What work was accepted by them?
Well, I had a series of poems, poems from a series that I was writing on about excuse me, coyote mythos. Only I took the coyote paradigm and I ramped it up to the present day. So coyote is eating pizza and hanging out in college bars and that sort of thing. So, and the prize was awarded for poems that had been published in Poetry Northwest, and the year that. And I think this is right. I think I split that prize with someone. One of the years that they awarded the prize to two people rather than just one. I think that's right. But that's how I got the prize. I appeared in the magazine the year that they were awarding it.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about, before we get back to some of your writing of poetry, as a reader of poetry, what are some of the things when you come across a poem or you come across one of those poets, one of those poems by the poets that you've mentioned, what are some of the things that you look for as a reader? What are some of the things that can maybe not inspire you, but help you realize the value of that poem as you're reading maybe a poet for the first time even?
Well, I think what I want to see from a work of art is I think I want to see how to live my life. And I want to see a perspective as to what is it like living in the 21st century. And I think I read literature to find that out. What was it like in 1890? What was it like in Chaucer's day and in Shakespeare's day and that sort of thing? And it's a reflection on the human experience. I'm going to display some biases here, but much of the poetry today seems to be a lot of verbal games and a lot of very cleverness with language, which in itself is okay, I guess, because poetry is, in a sense, elevated language. But much of it for me is just so clever, and that's all that's on the page is just cleverness. It's like biting into an apple. And somebody presents you with this nice red apple and you bite into it, and ultimately there's no flavor to it. And I suppose wisdom. I like wise poets and wise writers, and that's immediately apparent. Somebody who's seriously commenting on the human experience.
Excellent. You mentioned sort of the cleverness and sort of the human experience. I'm reminded as you were talking of Carl Sandburg's poem, "O Jasmine," and how if you hear an oral reading of that poem, it almost sounds like a jazz song. The way he's played with language, the way he uses the apostrophes, it sounds sort of like a jazz song. And I think maybe in that poem that it's an example of how you can be clever, but also, like you're saying, still keep true to the language and keep consistent with what you're trying to do, to talk about the human experience of music and what jazz is like.
Yeah, Carl Sandburg would be a good example of a traditional poet who is very oral and good sound and good presentation. And I remember when I was a kid, watching. When he was still alive, he would come on every so often. He'd come on television, black and white TV set with that shock of white hair, and he would present his stuff, and it was always worth. Today, I think a lot of people probably regard it as kind of a cornball, but that's probably their problem. They might be right. Most poets get dated, and I'm sure Sandberg's not immune to that, but
Sure. Absolutely. Let me ask you a little bit about your writing processes. You mentioned that you draw a lot of your experience from everyday life, a lot of experience, a lot of your inspiration rather from people that you know and from everyday experiences in life. So when you sit down to write a poem, do you write first on paper? Do you sit down at the computer? Do you have a certain style in terms of stanzas and length of poems, or how does all that come together for you?
excuse me, good question. There was a time when, I noticed you have a legal pad there, there was a time when the only way that I could start a poem would be to sit down with the legal pad and do that. Nowadays, now that I have beginning to come to grips with the 21st century and computers and all of that, and learn Facebook and those sorts of things, that I can now sit down at a computer console and actually two-finger type and begin a draft that way. But it used to be I had to use legal pads. As far as form, I've been working for a number of years on alternating long lines with shorter lines. One of the things that's really neat about writing poetry is the line breaks, and I don't quite know how I came to the form that I've been using, but it's long lines alternating with short lines, and so you can have all the drama of the beginning and especially the end of the lines and that pause at the end of the line and that sort of thing. So it just gives you more opportunity, and the shape of the poem or the container the poem takes, that's important.
So once you get that initial draft, like you were talking about earlier in our interview, once you get that down, how soon from that draft to the first revision, do you walk away from the poem for a couple of days, or do you go back through later on that same day? How do you make the step from first draft to revision? How long does it normally take you before you get into the first revision?
I never thought of that. I never thought of the question.
Didn't mean to stump you.
No, I just never occurred to me. Sometimes that same day, and I will finish a draft and I'll immediately start messing. Usually I'll do it the same day, and sometimes I put it away for a while. I think one of the things I need to work on is sending poems out too soon. I'll mess with a poem and work on it, and I say, well, this is done. Then I'll send it out, and I'll look at it, and I says, oh, no. No wonder they sent it back, with a rude note, because this just isn't making it. So the process continues.
Okay. That was a perfect segue into my next question. We were talking about some of the awards that you've won and some of the places where you've had your poems published. How do you go about looking for places to find poetry placement? Because we get that question a lot, in email and off the air. We talk about a lot of writers who get things published in certain places, and the question we get a lot is, well, how do I know where to go? Where do I look? What do I just sit down and do a Google search for literary journals? How do you go about finding places? And I imagine to some degree this is specific to each author, because depending on the kind of poetry that you write, maybe certain journals lean to that style. But how do you go about finding places for your poems?
Used to be that there used to be books about that sort of thing. There used to be something called the Directory of Little Mags, and I don't know whether they're still in print or not, but it was strictly a print. This was before everything became, immersed in cyberspace. But Poets and Writers, I suppose, is an excellent. Poets and Writers is a magazine that comes out. I think it's quarterly. I believe that's the case, and they have an online system for short story writers and poets. And the listing is they give you the name of the magazine, and then one gets a pretty good sense about what they're really looking for. Sometimes there's a blurb from the editors saying this is what we want, here's what we don't want, and they'll arrange subject headings like horror genre or LGBT and that sort of thing, alternate lifestyles, you name it. And these days, I think that task is much easier, I think, because of services and data banks such as Poets and Writers. Yeah. And it's always, the public library is perhaps one of the best resources for the person just starting out, is just to walk into a library and say, how do I get my wonderful poems published? And it's probably the best first step I can think of.
Okay, great. All right. And we're going to give you an opportunity here in just a few moments to read from some of your poetry, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about your teaching experience. You've taught at Kent State University, taught at Bowling Green State University, and retired from Ashland Community College. How did you get into teaching? Was that something that came as an extension of your poetry writing and liking to write and wanting to work with students in that regard? And how much poetry were you able to work into your teaching experience along the way?
Well, I got into teaching. I got into post-secondary education because I wrote poetry and went to grad school and all that sort of thing. And I decided, well, maybe I should take a shot at being a teacher. I think every graduate student in the back of his or her mind says, I want to be a teacher someday, because it doesn't pay too much, but it's a pretty good living. It's pretty good living. And when I went to Bowling Green after some absence from the academic world and enrolled in their creative writing workshop, one of the oldest ones, that they also had a program for teachers of English, and especially to train beginning English teachers. I had taught English as an adjunct, English composition. I taught English comp for a few years before I went up there, and they had it down. They had their system. They really knew what they were doing, and I thought, this is really great. So I came away from that experience really knowing how to teach comp, and that's what I did. In fact, I got to the point where I would rather teach comp than anything else.
Really?
And yeah.
That's great. That's great. I wanted to give us an opportunity in the few moments that we have remaining here with you to give you a chance to read some poetry from your collection.
Sure.
I know you've brought a book with you, so tell us a little bit about that
Sure.
book that you're reading from first, and then we'll let you read a little bit from it.
This book came from the University of Kentucky Press, is that right? And I better get that right, just to make sure here.
And we will certainly, as the interview has transpired, our audience has seen the cover of that book, and we'll certainly put it up
Yes.
on the screen as we wrap things up
Yeah.
during our interview today.
I apologize to all concerned. This is the University Press of Kentucky.
Okay.
Okay. This is an excellent anthology, I must say so, even though I'm in it. Came out a couple of years ago, and it's strictly Kentucky poets, and Wendell Berry is in it, and James Baker Hall, Poets Laureate Richard Taylor Josephant, George Ella Lyon, just reading names. Frank X. Walker, who I think is the poet laureate of Kentucky. And it's a very strong, powerful anthology, so buy the book. Come on. You ready for?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. Some years ago, about 20 some odd years ago, my brother died. And naturally that was an occasion of great grief, but it was also an occasion of writing poetry and at least getting ideas for poetry. And here's one that's from that sequence. Society. My brother cannot see us when we visit. His eyes are glazed and dead, and the half-shut lids do not flutter to keep them wet. Yesterday, we carried all his magazines downstairs, Town and Country, Vanity Fair, European Life. The nurses told us what to expect when the myriad sieves within him begin to clog and close. Hallucinate, she said. A gentle word that rustles and taps like a drift of maple seeds, a clinical word as bright and naked as reason itself, and those of the invisible who may be hovering above his bed or of no importance to our busy seasoned caregiver when she climbs the stairs to his room. Now we are only voices and hands who disturb the stale air that clings to him as we stroke his head and whisper and clean. As he says, "My God, who are all these people? Is this heaven? It must be heaven." And as his shoulders tense in the effort of reaching out, he turns his face up to the corner of his room, brings one thin hand to an open mouth in the ancient gesture of astonishment. Excuse me. Tries to wave at the people who wait past the black empty trees and the power lines heavy with dulling ice, past the twin chimneys on the steel mill behind our fence. So glad you could come. How marvelous.
Excellent. Very nice. Excellent poem. Very good. Well, Philip St. Clair, we are delighted to have you with us here today.
It was my pleasure.
On Chapters.
My pleasure coming.
And we appreciate you talking with us today. Again, Philip St. Clair, the author of 4 books of poetry, Acid Creek, Little Dog of Iron, At the Tent of Heaven, and In the 39 Steps. And you can get those books. What are the best way to get those, Philip, if anybody's interested in getting a copy of those?
I suppose they've been out of print for a long time. I suppose eBay, ABE books, there might even be some on Amazon, all of the online services that sell new and used books, and they've been out of print for a while.
Okay. Well, we certainly appreciate you sharing that one poem with us today.
Well, my pleasure.
And if anybody's interested in getting more poetry from Philip St. Clair, he's given you some ways in which you can find much of his poetry. So we certainly appreciate him joining us here today on Chapters. And finally, if you have a question, comment, or suggestion about our Chapters program, we would love to hear from you. You can send us an email directly to the show at lp4, that's the letter L, letter P, number 4, at zoominternet.net. We certainly appreciate all the email and the feedback that we do get on the program. We promise we read every correspondence that we get from you, and we do take your suggestions into consideration when we are setting up future episodes of our program. So please keep those comments coming. We look forward to hearing from you. Well, that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community. I'm Eliot Parker, and we'll see you next time.